Hey, look. Sean, our guest today, and we'd never spoken before, but we got along really well, and we talked for a really long time, so no stories about Buffy or old punk bands this week. I'm Josh Lindley, and this is Branching Out. Just straight to the goods with Sean Baxter. Sean is one of the founders of Never Never Gin in Adelaide, Australia. He came our way via Jenna Hemsworth, who he worked closely with as a mentor back when he was a brand ambassador for Johnny Walker, and you'll hear all about it in this interview. You will also hear that Sean actually likes Caesars. Gross. Here's Sean Baxter on Branching Out. Dear Sean Baxter, I'm so happy to have you on Branching Out. Rather than me reading a bio that I never asked you to write for me to read, can you tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name's Sean Baxter, and I'm the current brand director of a gin business. Oh, well, it's actually no longer a gin business; it's a spirit business called Never Never here in South Australia, in Adelaide. In Adelaide, yeah.
How long have you been running Never Never for?
It's our 10th year this year, which is terrifying because it means that I haven't done enough work on telling everyone it's our 10th year.
Congratulations.
We're about to actually launch into our 10th anniversary celebrations. Prior to that, I was working as a brand ambassador for Diageo, and prior to that, I was a bartender.
I'll get into all that shortly, but Sean, the reason that you were invited to be on this podcast is because a few weeks ago, months ago really, I talked to Jenna Hemsworth, and Jenna says you're very important in her career. You're one of her pillars, one of her mentors, but Jenna also asked me to ask you a question. Are you ready for it?
Okay, shoot.
Jenna Hemsworth wants to know, Sean Baxter, how do you find the patience to consistently give constructive feedback and stay positive? Do you ever want to just tell people not to quit their day jobs?
Jenna Jenna is a ray of sunshine. I think back when I was a brand ambassador, I'd often come across young bartenders who are interested and excited about various aspects of their burgeoning careers, and Jenna was certainly one of those. I think it's born in all people that love hospitality, really. I think when someone shows interest or is actually excited to deal with people, I'm sure you wouldn't be that shocked, Josh, to know that there's a significant portion of bartenders that genuinely just hate people. And I can't quite work out why they do what they do. But, there's lots of really well-paid mining jobs in Australia where you could just go earn 10 times the amount and be in a hole and don't have to deal with anybody, really. But she was one that actively really enjoyed what she was doing. So she was an absolute delight and is an absolute delight. I'm still very good friends with her today and enjoy what she's doing and try and support her as much as I have always supported her. So, yeah, I would say finding the patience to deal with people like Jenna is very, very easy because she's an absolute delight and one of the reasons why I love hospitality so much.
What about the people who aren't like Jenna, though, who aren't necessarily a delight, and maybe they try a drink 5 different ways, they approach it from every angle they think, and it still kind of tastes shit? How do you deal with giving them constructive criticism?
I think the idea of when you're working as a brand ambassador, and I met Jenna when I was working as a brand ambassador, specifically when I was working for World Class. So when I was actually a judge and assisting in the way that we were selecting finalists across Australia. And it's probably one of the hardest things when you've got someone who is really, really close to to cracking through into the big time, or at the opposite end, a million miles away, and can't balance a Negroni, and that's when you get to. I think it just comes down to being upfront and being very transparent and being very authentic, and I think those are things that have done me very well in life all the way through. Being authentic and being transparent is incredibly hard when you're working for Diageo. They probably, we used to always sort of struggle a little bit when it comes to, give us a little bit more authenticity when it comes to, some of the brands that are very, hold their cards very tight to their chest, which I guess is, their prerogative. That was never my way when we started when we started Never Never. That was always a big thing for me. But yeah, I guess when it comes to how you deal with those people, it's being very upfront and being very clear and doing your very best, not sugarcoat anything. That's always been the way I've tried to do it.
Mm-hmm. So, Sean, you and I have never met before, and I think it's important the listeners know that I'm talking to you at 6 a.m. your time.
Yes.
And I've already thrown, I feel like that question from Jenna was a pretty heavy lob for 6 a.m. So let's dial it back a little bit. Before you ran Never Never and before you were a brand ambassador, you worked as a bartender.
Yes, I loved it.
And around what time and what cities were you a bartender in?
I started bartending, funnily enough, I worked as a gap student, as most Australians do at some stage of their young careers. I worked overseas in a Scottish town, of all places, called Dunblane. And I lied. I said I was a young Australian bartender back home. I had stepped into a bar, but I had never worked in one. And I thought, how hard could it be? I was pulling pints in a little town called Dunblane. So I started that in 2001, and then when I got back to Australia after that year, I sort of progressively worked through pubs in Queensland into nightclubs, which is where I really, some would say maybe lost my way, but I sort of found the light. Certainly saw hospitality in a different aspect, and then moved to Melbourne, which in Australia is a bit more of the mecca, I guess, of at that stage in the early 2000s. That was very much the hub of cocktail bartending, I think, in Australia, where you could work 7 days a week if you wanted. And worked there until about 2010, 2011, before sort of stepping into brand ambassador work, and eventually moving to Sydney and then to Adelaide, where we started the Never Never brand.
Mm-hmm. You said you were in clubs when you were up in Queensland. Do you find that doing that very loud, very high pressure, very high volume helped out when you would move to Melbourne and had to start making cocktails really quickly?
I mean, I've always been a pretty slow and messy bartender, and I think that's. I still remember a boss of mine who I won't name, who gave me the nickname the Slug because I was slow and left a trail of shit everywhere. And that was pretty much something that stuck with me, I think, throughout my whole career. I kind of managed my way through, I guess, trying to be as quick and as clean as I could possibly be, but that's still not necessarily what you'd call either of those two things. But I think nightclubs taught me the most about working with people, understanding people's mental health. Mm-hmm. Young kids that find themselves working in nightclubs come from all different traits in life, and I think that was the first time that I was sort of thrust into this large group of young adults all trying to make their way in life, and some were on the straight and narrow, and others were far from it. So I think it taught me more about my staff culture and working with people than it probably did more about the specifications for a Negroni, which were largely ignored in a nightclub that poured out troughs of vodka, Red Bull, and Jägermeister shots.
Mm-hmm. When you got to Melbourne, where were you working?
I was working in a little bar called Manchuria, which often didn't get enough credit, I think. It was one of those bars that I still love, these sorts of bars where you walk in, it's windowless. It felt like it could have been in a basement, but it was a second floor bar in Chinatown, and you'd walk through these massive, big, heavy lion doors that it felt like you needed a gym membership to enter, and you just immediately walked in and you were transported. It was this amazing space. It's still operational, which I think in Melbourne terms, it's quite surreal to think it's still going. You've got to be quite established now, I think, to surpass the 12, 13, 14-year mark in bars. But it was a very special bar. It taught me a lot about classics, about cocktails that hadn't been sort of seen the light of day, at least from my perspective, in a long time. And the operator there was very astute, I guess, in his education, I should say. He tried to knock the liqueur 43 out of my hand, and which is nothing wrong with that. Nightclubs tend to lead into those sorts of products. and started trying to train me about how to sort of let go of the sugar syrup as a balancer and start working with the actual spirits and liqueurs that, the recipes actually call for, as opposed to, the bartender ketchup that we often kind of lean on.
Do you find that was the turning point for you when you started working in Melbourne, where you were like, this is what I'm going to do? I'm a bar person now.
Yeah, I funnily enough, nearly all the way through my career, I felt that I was sort of always waiting for the next thing. And it took me quite a long time to realize that I was born into hospitality. And it was a real sudden realization. All these sorts of conversations I had, like I grew up in the country Queensland, which is a little town called Cookeva. It was very regional. It certainly didn't have a nightlife. There was a pub. It was a mining town. The pub was rough as guts. It was even too rough for my father, which I thought was quite crazy, because I thought my dad was the hardest person I knew. But it certainly. My mother had come from Glasgow in Scotland. She loved the nightlife, was very metropolitan in her personality, and would always go to restaurants, would take us to restaurants when we went down to Brisbane, and the capital city of Brisbane. Mm-hmm. That was, I think, when I saw bartenders for the first time and was just enthralled by their capacity to hold a room. I remember when I was in year 11, the second last year of schooling in Queensland, and I was in boarding school. Mum took me out for a night. I was sitting in sitting in a restaurant in Brisbane called Jojo's, and I was, which is not a great restaurant if anyone remembers. It was like a food court. But I still remember this bartender who was just seemingly in control of the room, but also, I should say, doing quite well with. He had a couple of people in front of him who was clearly enamored with and chatting up, and I was just inspired by that person's confidence and their ability to do so many things at once. And I found that to be a real, when I get out of school, I'm gonna be a bartender. I wasn't so much worried about what I wanted to study. I was like, I'm gonna do that. And I never stopped doing that. And I did study, and I did, I guess I studied Bachelor of Communications and Journalism, and that certainly assisted where I'm at now. I write many a press release, so I always tell my mother, see, I did use it. But it was the long way around, as opposed to actually sort of seeing it. So, yeah, I've always been on this track. Even when I didn't think I wanted to be, I always sort of found my way back into parts of hospitality that are so special and so rewarding.
Outside of writing press releases for Never Never, do you find yourself analyzing or over-analyzing any articles you read or any other podcasts you listen to? Or do you find that it's gotten in the way because you know how to put something like that together?
Oh, definitely. It's always assisted in some capacity. I think that's the wonderful thing about knowledge or education. It's not just about the piece of paper. It's the way that it shapes you. And I guess it's the way you sort of start to sort of see life a bit. But I don't think it's gotten in the way. I think it's certainly given me a leg up in the way I've absorbed information, the way that I've analysed or critiqued a particular articles or opinions. But I think it's always assisted. You mentioned earlier about ways that it how you get patience or how you manage people. I think being analytical about situations is certainly assists you in the way that you deal with particular situations or things that occur in a bar or restaurant or even when you're training a group of young bartenders. So it's certainly Mum was right, I should say. I was so ready to quit. I was working as a nightclub manager in my second year of study. I was already earning more than a young cadet journalist would ever earn in their first couple of years of work. And I was having the best time of my life. Genuinely, that working as a bar manager in that nightclub did more for my self-confidence, I think, than anything else I've done in my career. So it was my mum who was like, just finish the thing, all right? Just keep studying. And here in Australia, you've got this thing called HEX debt, which is how you pay it off. And I remember cursing my mother all the way through my 20s, watching my tax being deducted into my HEX debt for this thing that I never actually felt like I used up until I realized I was using it every day.
Yeah, up until you used it, yeah. So you worked as a brand ambassador with Diageo and World Class for a bit. And then at what point did you decide to strike out on your own and run Never Never? And you're not just on your own. You have business partners.
Absolutely. I wouldn't have been able to do it as a ex brand ambassador without the knowledge of my two other co-founders, Tim and George. But I was working in Sydney as the national brand ambassador for Johnny Walker and the Classic Vault. So loving it, loved whiskey, I still love whiskey. And just love enjoying life. You work as a BA to get into those particular positions, which, you know, one day you're doing a tasting session for the Australian cricket team at the Sydney Cricket Ground, and then the next you're doing, an international trip to Singapore to do a high roller room in one of their affluent hotels. Like there's just so many amazing sort of day in the life when you're that kind of role. But my beautiful wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, I had met her in Melbourne. She had given me a bit of an ultimatum. She had lived in Sydney and hated it, and I got this opportunity to go and work in Sydney. She said, "Okay, well, if we go to Sydney, you've got 3 years." And then we've got to move to Adelaide because I want to start a family and I want to get on to this next stage. And if you're not ready to be on that track with me, then, you know, let's talk about it. But if you are, that's the ultimatum. And I remember 2.5 years, I was like, what am I going to do in South Australia? Like it's a much smaller, Adelaide's a much smaller city than Sydney. It certainly doesn't offer you as much opportunity as what I was currently doing. And I knew I'd have to leave that job. And it was at that stage one of her friends, Tim, who had been secretly distilling in a shed at that stage, approached me, knowing full well that I was relocating to Adelaide without a job, and was like, would you be interested in potentially helping begin this business? And it was he who introduced me to George, who was the other founding member of Never Never, at Whisky Live, of all places, in Adelaide, a whisky expo. And he said, I want to be a part of it. So the three of us sort of hashed out this idea with very little cash, started distilling in the back of a brewery because they gave us free rent, which we quickly worked out why when we saw the room we were brewing in, distilling in. And that's where Never Never was certainly born. So yes, it was I would say quite fortuitously that it was a lot of things falling into place, but it was largely my wife that kind of gave me the opportunity, because without her, I don't think I would have ever considered Adelaide a home, and I certainly would never have met Tim, who was really, I think, the secret sauce in how we started the business.
So as we're talking about Tim, as we're talking about your wife for that matter, as far as your career and who you've been as a brand ambassador, as a bartender, as a distiller, who do you say are your mentors or your pillars? Who propped you up and sort of gave you guidance along the way?
It's like I was thinking about this when we were talking earlier, when you mentioned about Jenna, and it's quite an interesting thing, sort of thinking back through your career as to who were the real people that made a big difference in the person that you became. A lot of my mentors, or a lot of the people that I, especially early on, were really close friends that I, drink heavily with them or party with, and I didn't consider them mentors at the time, but they were people that I looked up to, people that I aspired to be like. There's certainly a lot of them, but I think when I was at my earliest stage in my career, when I was at that sliding doors moment, when I was thinking about moving to Melbourne, that was probably that moment where I started thinking about taking myself a bit more seriously in hospitality. At that stage, I was still a nightclub bartender that was knocking out, the most complicated sort of drinks I was doing were blended strawberry or mango kind of daiquiris, which are still delicious. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that category of spirit, category of cocktail. There's a man called Barry Chalmers. Now, Barry is a very well-known bartender in Australia and the UK. He's not bartending at the moment. He's working as he's doing all manner of different jobs, I think, back in Scotland. But he was a Scottish bartender who worked at a bar called Bowery in Brisbane, which was an incredible space. It's no longer operational, but Bowery was this real home of classic bartending and classic cocktails. And it was just this thumping, beautiful space that I just loved sitting at the bar and watching their bartenders do their thing. And Barry was the first person who taught me how to drink a Negroni and how to drink a martini, how to make those drinks. But more than that, Barry actually was someone who was well regarded in the industry and had walked this particular path in a way which was so unique and so inspiring. He had already been featured in, I remember David Broom, who I had the luxury of being able to meet later in my career working with whiskey. He had already featured as a cocktail in the back of David Broom's rum book, which I was at that stage starting to pour through a little bit more spirit literature and get a bit more of an understanding about what I was dealing with. He was helping me with the earliest sort of cocktail competitions that I was entering, and I was only entering these things because they offered cash prizes. I was okay. I was okay at being on stage and talking, and I quickly realised that if I had a little bit more knowledge or had a little bit more understanding about the brands that I was representing, that you'd often do well. If you talk a little bit of brand history, suddenly you tick a box on a criteria sheet. So he was the one that was actually giving me these inside lines and inside tips. But more importantly than that, he was someone that taught me to take myself seriously. And I think at that stage, I was a young cocktail bartender working in a nightclub. He was certainly somebody that taught me that if you get as much out of this industry as you put in. So if you really work hard and you take yourself seriously, if you study, if you treat it like a job that you can continue to excel at rather than just punching your ticket every day, which is what I was doing, you'll continue to excel. And that advice has done me very well, and has certainly been something that has continued to impact me throughout every particular stage, pushing yourself hard, but never losing, I think, the crux of hospitality, which is always putting yourself out there, doing as much as you can for other people, paying it forward every single opportunity that you can. And he was, I think, the person that inspired that most in me for that reason.
It sounds like some of the lessons that he gave you probably helped out later when you became a brand ambassador as well, as far as him guiding you as to how to describe a spirit or talk about a brand. Probably came in handy when you were dealing with Tanqueray or Kettle One or whoever else with Diageo, yeah?
Absolutely. Interestingly enough, Barry would move to Sydney and work for a business called Behind Bars, which was a training program or a business that was working in training, run by a wonderful man called Sven Almenning. So Sven would select all of these young bartenders that excelled in competitions or could manage standing in front of an audience or were well educated, and these young men and women would train other people, train other bartenders around the country. That's actually where I met Jenna for the first time. But Barry was one of the trainers there. So I got to know Barry even more through that process. I always remember giving him a fair bit of rubbish because I was like, there was these two guys, Marco and Barry, and Marco was French and Barry was Scottish, and both of them were, I could barely understand them when they opened their mouths, audible. Yeah. So I always found them quite challenging to listen to, but they were, both of those gentlemen, but in particular Barry, were just absolute icons within our industry. And not only did Barry teach me a lot about bartending and taking myself seriously in that particular direction, but when I actually chose to step into brand ambassador work, he really helped me there and really taught me a lot about how to continue to excel, I guess, at that particular part of my career. So, when I was reflecting on, there was so many other people that, there's another man called Greg Sanderson who also worked, funnily enough, at Behind Bars. He was the one that gave me the job as a brand ambassador. He was my roommate. He was another bartender in Australia that was very similar, who worked his ass off, trained and studied, and he won Bartender of the Year here in Australia, which is a pretty big award. He was another person at Behind Bars that was so dedicated and was very close to being that same person. But I think it's Barry who was the one that actually got me out of nightclubs in Brisbane and taught me that, no, if you work hard, you could be a cocktail bartender. Sure, you'll still be slow and messy as shit, but you can work on that as well.
The Slug is so vicious. That's such a mean name. Man.
I wear it as a badge of honor now, so I enjoy telling the story.
Sure.
Because if the Slug can work their way up and still make something of a hospitality career, albeit maybe not in bars, you can do whatever you want in life. So that was probably one of the best bits of advice that my mother actually taught me was, I loved hospitality so much. And I love the industry so much. I think it's full of some of the most genuine people you'll ever meet, people that put themselves last when it comes to the way that they look after other people. I think that's just when you surround yourself with people that have that prerogative, it's such a rewarding industry. People will always look after you. You're always so rich, even if it's not particularly monetarily.
Mm-hmm.
That was definitely I think one of the things that my mum sort of instilled in me is that idea of always be hospitable to people.
If you had a question to ask Barry, if I managed to hunt this man down and ask him a question on your behalf, what would that question be? That
question would be, and I thought long and hard about Barry, because Barry's no longer in the industry, and I think it's not because of his own doing. I think he's just he's maybe lost his way a little bit when it comes to hospitality. Okay, Barry, what is it about hospitality that drew you in and gave you such a sage-like position when it came to assisting young bartenders such as myself? But why is it that perhaps you've stepped away from it? How has the light gone out for you when it comes to hospitality? Why did you decide to leave it? I think that would be an interesting question to ask him.
Does Barry, having never met Barry, does he seem like the kind of guy who will handle that well coming from a stranger?
Maybe.
Could go either way.
Barry's a very intelligent man, and he still is in hospitality. It's just not perhaps in the hospitality industry as we see it. He still deals with people every day and has to be he works in Scotland, I guess, in hospitality in a way that's slightly different. So I guess he's still in hospitality.
Sure.
Yeah. Let me think about that one, Josh. I'm not sure. That was a really interesting question.
No stress.
I should have been more prepared for that.
No stress about that at all. Sean, who else sticks out in your head as being someone that sort of gave you some guidance along the way?
There's another gentleman by the name of Chris Highstead. So Chris Highstead is you're nodding your head like you understand. You know who Chris Highstead is? So
I have consumed daiquiris with that man.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that makes it even, maybe slightly easier. Chris is as a young bartender, I met him at Black Pearl in Melbourne. And I immediately, there's certain people that you just gravitate towards immediately, not just because of the enormous cranium that would actually draw in other elements almost into its orbit. But he was such a incredible bartender. He's the creator of the death flip. Still one of the wildest tricks. I remember the first time he was talking about it, and I was like, you're insane. Like it felt like he was just grabbing everything from the bar and stick it into a sour. But it was...
Sorry, Sean, for the sake of the listeners, tell us how to make a death flip.
Oh my God. It's probably I'm pretty sure it's equal parts. I can't remember. I haven't made one in years, but it's like yellow chartreuse, it's tequila, it's a Jägermeister, and a whole egg. Am I right in that respect? I'm pretty sure.
Sounds
Am
right,
I missing anything? And maybe some sugar syrup. And it's become this badge of honor that he's carried throughout his life, as it should. Like those ingredients just shouldn't go together. But when you put them all in the glass and you shake it with the fattiness of an egg yolk, and it just transforms it into this very, very unique beast. And more than that though, he was a bartender that I met more so through World Class. He was entering every year. He did very well in that competition without ever winning it here in Australia. But his ability with flavour, his capacity to continue to see through the matrix when it comes to how you put together unique and creative cocktails was something that was just awe-inspiring to sit in front of. And as someone who just loved flavour myself, I always felt quite embarrassed judging him in these cocktail competitions because he was a far better bartender than I ever was. I was in this awkward position almost where I was this trainer. I was very good at recounting brand work and telling people how to do the very basics, embarrassingly telling people how to be a clean bartender when I myself knew very well that I could not do those things. So when I sat in front of what's that knowledge? If those that can't do teach. But it was always embarrassing sitting in front of Chris because he was just, his capacity to create unique creations is such a beautiful thing to watch. And that he's another person a little bit similar to myself who stepped out of the industry but has always been in hospitality. He now works as one of the creative labs at Moondog Brewery. And it's just and he's creating ready-to-drink mixer drinks or beer flavors or unique kind of things that come out of that lab. And it's just perfect for him because his ability with flavor is something that I've always been inspired by. So whereas by that stage when I met Chris, I was well established in my career, at least directionally, I felt like I was well entrenched. He was someone that, again, was just a delight and a joy to sit in front of because he just made you feel. There's certain bartenders that have the capacity to just make you feel amazing without filling you full of alcohol, and it's because of the way that they talk to you and the way that they put things in front of you that you're inspired by their creativity and their cocktails. And he was one of those people. So Chris, if he's listening, is absolute legend.
What would you ask Chris if you had to sit down with him and pick his brain about something?
I would ask him why he thought serving a cocktail in a noodle box was a great idea for world class in, I think, 2010. A good example of maybe pushing the boundaries of cocktail creativity. But I remember very clearly that cocktail. And like the fact I can still remember that cocktail is probably an indication that it was a success either way. So I think he'll enjoy that. Probably less heavy than Barry.
Yeah, a little easier to get at the answer. There is, around the time I decided to quit doing cocktail competitions here in Toronto, there was a guy who served a Caesar, which as an Aussie, hopefully you haven't had contacts with a Caesar. Essentially, it's a Bloody Mary, but with clam juice in it as well.
I love a Caesar. I love a Caesar. Oh, it's a delight.
I'm glad someone thinks so.
Well, we have an oyster shell gin, so that's probably an indication as to my love for savoury.
I will take the oyster shell gin, but I was presented a Caesar once that was served in a duck. It was like a Peking style fried whole duck, and it had been, I can't remember if there was a glass in it. Anyway, the point is you would tear off a piece of the duck, take a bite, and then take a sip of the Caesar. And in that moment, I was like, I think this is it. I think I'm done with cocktail competitions now. That should be good. I feel like the noodle box is sort of on the same level there. Yeah.
Well, like I'll say it was a clean noodle box. He wasn't serving it, a used noodle box. So there was definitely world class is such an amazing competition because it does push you. And I still remember when Tim Phillips, I was judging Tim in Sydney and he served me up the Resurrection, the famous egg that he injected full of a cocktail and ended up winning it. And a year later, they were serving it at Bulletin Place, and poor Rob Sloan, his business partner, was having to blow eggs every day to create this drink. I think there's a limit, I think, to your patience when it comes to what you have to do to continue to create in this industry. But yeah, there's been a lot of Peking duck similar experiences that have popped up through that competition for sure.
Yeah, sure. Sean, I've kept you for a half hour already. Do you have anyone else you want to give a shout out to?
I've shouted out a few people, but I think one other particular gentleman that has been quite important, I think, in my career is a man by the name of Jason Williams. So Jason is he actually bartended at a family nightclub as well in Brisbane. He's another Brisbane boy. And he was this amazing person that seemed to be just a couple of steps ahead of me in my career. He literally moved to Melbourne and started working at an amazing bar called Ginger. No longer with us, unfortunately, but it inspired some amazing bartenders. Sam Ross was a bartender at Ginger, and again, someone that I met.
Well, it's his big sister's bar, correct?
It is, Alex. Yes, correct. And Alex is another. I won't even go with Alex. She's an amazing beast of a human and a huge personality. But Jason was someone that seemingly was always in my life, especially when I was in Melbourne, and he really shone, I guess, a lot on how to build your career in this industry too. Jace sort of worked in bars up until a point, but then realised that his value was in not his value, but his real I guess capacity for continued sort of success in the industry was actually stepping back and became a cocktail director, beverage director of larger groups. He worked for Keystone in Sydney, and then he worked overseas for Proof, a business that would actually end up becoming a distributor for our gin. And Jace actually had a fair bit to do with that as well. So my success as a brand director of a now pretty significant gin business had a lot to do with someone like Jason looking at my spirit at the time, and there's 100 other gins in the market, but understood who I was and understood what I represented as a human, and decided to give us a shot, as a core gin in his portfolio of spirits. So Jace and continues to do so now with his Housemate Hospitality in Sydney. So there's definitely a lot of, I guess, of my personal success that's attached to people like Jason Williams, who I've felt, which would be completely wild if I took myself back 15 years ago and found myself in his house at 4:00 in the morning with Chris Heisted, drinking beers, watching sport at whatever time in the morning, after our shifts, at various different places. Club 86 it was called, which was in Fitzroy. And if we had all sort of stepped back and looked at where we ended up in our various careers, I think we'd all be quite shocked, because we've all landed in, we've all largely continued on in this industry in ways which has been quite successful. So Jason would be another.
I feel like Club 86 has expanded to pretty much every city I've ever been to.
I think there's a Club 86 in most cities, where you find whatever's the closest bartender's house to whatever particular strip of late night venues. It becomes the kick-on place. I lived with Greg Sanderson in Fitzroy as well, and we had although it wasn't anywhere near as convenient as Club 86, it was a big share house, and you'd always wake up at 2:00 in the afternoon and there'd be still 3 or 4 people upstairs, either passed out or continuing on whatever particular direction that they had decided to take that day. So yes, it very, very much a part of that part of my life for sure.
Is there anything I should ask Jason if I hunt him down?
If you hunt Jace down, at what stage did you see your career moving from behind the bar making drinks to in the office scheduling cocktail masterclasses across a group of 6 or 7 venues? Where did it switch over for you, and how did you know that this was the direction that you wanted to take?
That's a reasonable question, I think, for a lot of friends that are about our age.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It's taking that next step, understanding when, was it out of passion or desperation?
Yeah.
Because I know he loves bartending. He's still a very good bartender. And that's the thing with Chris and Barry and Jace, and Greg, I should say. They're all incredible bartenders still. You ask them to make a drink at a party, they're the first ones to, whip out the required utensils to make you the perfectly balanced representation of it.
Amazing. Sean, again, thank you so much for meeting up with me so early on your holiday to sit and talk with me.
Oh, that's all right.
If anybody is looking for you or wants to learn about you or Never Never Gin, how do they do that?
Oh, look, you can please reach out to me in South Australia, in Adelaide, if you come visit. We're based in McLaren Vale. We'd love to be able to host you. We're very passionate about our cocktail program at our distillery. So if you do like a martini or we've got an incredible paper bark smoked martini, which is not mine, I should say. It sounds very fancy, so it's clearly not something that I made. We've got a wonderful bartender, Wuna, who made that one up. You can find me at there, or of course reach out to me through the usual sort of social media handles that you can find me at Sean of the Never Never on Instagram, which is usually a good place to catch me for a question.
Amazing. Sean, again, thank you so much.
Hey, Josh, it's been a real pleasure. I'm going to go and make myself a coffee.
Some very deep and some not so deep questions there. Mostly, I love that despite Sean and I never having met, sharing a mutual understanding and respect of what this industry can be like. Mostly, I think I made a friend. And that's nice, right? If you've made it this far into the show, I'm guessing you like it. Let us know by liking and subscribing on whatever app you're using, but mostly just tell your friends about branching out. If you're a bartender, please sign up to be on Bartender Atlas, or at the very least, follow us on Insta at Bartender Atlas. Branching Out is put together at Action Pact Studios in Toronto. It's written by me, additional research by Charlotte Castanel, engineering by Jesse Colburn, and other production and all music by Aaron Verdonk. Talk soon.